Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are tracing the path of a device that quite literally rewired the modern world. Back in 2007, Apple launched what a lot of people consider to be a highly secretive and honestly incredibly risky experiment. But fast forward to today, that experiment has evolved into an absolute tech juggernaut. All right, let's kick things off with this absolute jaw-dropper of a number. 3 billion. That is the number of iPhones sold as of July 2025. It's just crazy to think about. But it's not even just about the sheer volume of devices they've moved. See, despite Android having a much larger installed user base globally, the iPhone's premium positioning allows Apple to capture a staggering 80% of the entire global smartphone industry's profits. So how on earth did one single device conquer the market so absolutely? Well, let's find out. Section 1. The Spark. Igniting the Mobile Revolution. When Steve Jobs walked onto that Macworld stage back in January 2007, his vision was crystal clear. He wanted to replace those clunky physical phone keyboards everyone was using and get rid of them forever, swapping them out for a dynamic, touch-friendly interface. And we see that massive ignition point right there in 2007. Then, by 2008, boom, Apple introduces the App Store and 3G connectivity. Jump ahead to 2017 with the iPhone X, and we see the iconic home button just vanish, replaced by that nearly bezel-less display and Face ID. By 2020, they're throwing in 5G and MagSafe charging, and now, sitting here in the 2025 and 2026 era, we've got the ultra-thin iPhone Air and the super powerful 17 lineup. But every empire needs a foundation, right? And for Apple, that foundation was built on one very specific piece of tech. That technology was multi-touch. Now, before the iPhone, Apple had actually tried collaborating with Motorola on the Rocker E1. But that phone was heavily restricted by a sort of design-by-committee approach, and Apple just completely rejected that model. By deciding to develop the hardware and the software entirely in-house, they were able to properly implement multi-touch. This single technological leap, the ability to just naturally control a screen with multiple fingers instead of tapping away with a stylus, was the spark that permanently changed how humans communicate. But here's the thing. Apple didn't just want to sell you a piece of hardware. They wanted you to essentially live inside their software. Which brings us to Section 2, the moat, building the walled garden. So this is where we see that massive strategic shift toward an inescapable digital ecosystem. The absolute cornerstone of this moat is the App Store, which today houses nearly 2 million applications. And the economics and control here, they are highly, highly structured. Every single app has to pass Apple's strict review process. Developers have to pay a $99 yearly fee just for the privilege to participate. And crucially, Apple takes a 15 to 30% cut of app proceeds. It's a multi-billion-dollar walled garden, and it's carefully curated and strictly governed. And you know exactly how this walled garden affects our daily lives. It's the infamous blue versus green bubble phenomenon. Within iOS, those blue bubbles mean seamless iMessage integration, high-quality photos, and read receipts. It just works. But the second you text an Android user, it falls back to green bubbles. And traditionally, that results in degraded media and completely broken group chats. This brilliantly simple interface design actually acts as a massive psychological moat. It heavily incentivizes users to stay locked right inside the Apple ecosystem just to maintain seamless communication with their friends and family. And the sheer impact of that psychological moat is undeniable. I mean, just listen to this striking statistic. 88% of teenagers in the US use iPhones. That social pressure, which is often tied directly to not wanting to be the dreaded green bubble in a group chat, fuels this massive, deeply ingrained brand loyalty from a really young age. So, okay, they've got the software lock-in figured out. But how do they actually physically build hundreds of millions of these incredibly complex devices every single year? Let's look at Section 3, the blueprint, control from factory to pocket. The manufacturing journey of an iPhone is literally a marvel of modern logistics. Step 1 is sourcing individual components from all over the globe. Step 2 is assembly. Now, historically, this was heavily concentrated in China with major contractors like Foxconn and Pegatron. However, Apple is strategically diversifying right now. To avoid supply chain disruptions like the ones we saw during those zero-COVID lockdowns, they are shifting a significant amount of assembly over to India through partners like the Tata Group and Wistron. In fact, their goal is to make 25% of all iPhones in India by 2025. And finally, step 3, selling them directly through their own pristine retail stores and specialized upgrade programs. They want to completely control the customer experience right from the factory floor straight to your pocket. And Apple's control extends even after you buy the phone. They strictly enforce a genuine parts-only system. If someone installs a third-party battery or screen without using Apple's proprietary system configuration tool, the software is going to notice. It will issue continuous warnings in the Settings app, and it will actually disable certain features entirely, like True Tone or your battery health measurements. Which brings us right into the middle of a massive, ongoing legislative tug-of-war over repairability. On one side, you have right-to-repair advocates. They're pushing for laws across the US, UK, and the EU to mandate cheaper, much more accessible repair options for consumers. On the flip side, Apple has actively lobbied against this legislation, arguing that maintaining their parts pairing strategy is absolutely crucial to ensure device quality and user security. They have, however, compromised a bit recently by offering a limited self-service repair program, which allows users to rent tools and buy parts directly from them. Section 4. The Siege: Privacy and Security Battles. Because let's face it, your iPhone is way more than just a communication tool. It is a literal vault that contains your most sensitive personal information. So, the fundamental question we always have to ask is, who holds the keys to your data? That one simple question has triggered massive cultural and legal battles regarding encryption, location tracking, and state surveillance. You might remember the most famous example of this, the 2015 standoff between Apple and the FBI. Following the tragic San Bernardino attack, the U.S. government demanded that Apple create a custom iOS backdoor to bypass the passcode on the attacker's iPhone 5C. But Apple firmly refused. Their core argument was that universal, file-based encryption simply must be maintained, and that creating a backdoor, even just for law enforcement, would fundamentally compromise the digital privacy and security of every single iPhone user globally. It was, and still remains, a defining debate between the needs of state security and the right to absolute digital privacy. And, that device security is constantly under threat from some incredibly sophisticated actors out there. Take Pegasus, for example. This is a terrifying cyber threat. It's what's known as a zero-click spyware suite, which means it can fully compromise an iPhone without the user clicking a link or doing anything at all. No interaction required. It can remotely harvest chats, grab passwords, turn on the microphone, and access your photos. The threat was actually so severe that Apple was forced to introduce a specialized lockdown mode specifically to protect vulnerable targets like activists and journalists from these kind of state-sponsored attacks. But Apple also flexes its privacy muscles against corporate tracking. Consider app tracking transparency, which they introduced back in iOS 14.5. This feature requires apps to ask for your explicit permission before they can track you across other apps and websites, basically by blocking their access to Apple's identifier for advertisers. So the really crucial takeaway here is that while this brilliantly bolsters user privacy, it simultaneously dealt a massive financial blow to ad-reliant competitors, heavily impacting the revenues of companies like Meta. All right, so we've seen the hardware, the software mode, the sprawling supply chain, and the intense privacy battles, which brings us to exactly where we are today. Section 5. The Hegemon, a global juggernaut. As we sit here in 2026, the sheer market dominance of the iPhone is staggering. Like we mentioned earlier, even though Android holds the vast majority of smartphone users globally, Apple's strategy is undeniably lucrative. By focusing almost entirely on the premium market, and they account for about 78% of the high-end smartphone market, Apple captures a staggering 80% of the entire industry's profits. That leaves Samsung and literally all other competitors scrambling to fight over the remaining 20%. And to maintain this massive lead, Apple iterates its hardware relentlessly to make sure they cover every single segment of that premium market. Just look at the late 2025 and early 2026 lineup. You have the massive 6.9-inch iPhone 17 Pro Max, featuring advanced vapor chamber cooling for heavy workloads. Then, the standard iPhone 17 finally brings the always-on display right down to the baseline model. We have the radically redesigned iPhone Air, which is the thinnest iPhone ever, debuting Apple's ultra-efficient C1X cellular modem. And finally, rounding the whole thing out in March 2026, we get the 17e, designed as the budget-friendly entry point into the entire ecosystem. Which really leaves us with a final, fascinating question to ponder. The iPhone started out as this wild, risky disruptor that completely redefined human connection. But now, nearly 20 years and 3 billion devices later, it literally dictates supply chains, it fights national governments, and it commands the lion's share of global tech profits. So what happens when the ultimate disruptor becomes the ultimate establishment? Thank you so much for joining me and diving into this explainer today, Focus Learners. Keep questioning and keep learning.